Good afternoon and welcome back to the Spirit of Scotland 1314 as we continue our series of looking at places and events that were pertinent to the Battle of Bannockburn 1314. In this episode we're going to be looking at the crossing places of the Bannockburn, the bridges and fords that possibly existed in 1314. Perhaps compare with what's here today to give us an idea. So the place I've brought you to this afternoon is a place on the Bannockburn where it is perceived that the Roman road crossed the Bannockburn on the way up towards Stirling main town. And we know that when the English left Edinburgh Linlithgow area and came along towards Bannockburn, they followed the track of the old Roman road. Then what happened when they got to the Bannockburn? Was there still a crossing, a ford or a bridge on the Bannockburn in the area of the old Roman road? So we'll look at that and then we'll go further downstream and we'll look at some of the other fords and bridges that may have existed at that time. So for this one, for the Roman road, it's perhaps best that we take a wider view and look at a map, and it can give us an aerial perspective of where we are and the routes that might have been taken, and we'll discuss the possibilities of a bridge still being here, you know, more than 1100 years after the Romans left Scotland and before the Battle of Bannockburn. So let's go and have a look at that just now. We'll start by looking at the Roman road in the vicinity of Croftside Park Farm here. The Roman road came along the same lines as the modern road we see here as it came through the Torwood, through which the English advanced on its way to Bannockburn in June 1314. And here we see in the dashed line the proposed route of the Roman road as it took its way towards the Bannockburn. You see it going past the Pirn Hall here on this map, which is a post-1888 map, and I've used this just for clarity. But the topography is the same as today, and we see here where the proposed route of the Roman road is said to have crossed the Bannockburn. Why would they have chose to cross there if this is indeed the route that the Roman road had taken? Well, let's look at the LiDAR map and we can kind of get an idea of why that might be the case. When you look at the LiDAR map, you see just how low-lying the banks of the Bannockburn here and flat on either side of the burn. So access and egress are easy, and the engineering for the Romans would be a lot easier crossing here. So I can see why it's proposed that there would be a Roman bridge here. It would make it so much easier for the engineers, where if you go further downstream on the Bannockburn, you can start to see it gets a bit more gorge-like, and further down it gets even more wider and difficult to cross and engineer. So it seems like a sensible location. Was there ever a bridge there? Well, there's never any evidence been found. But we've got to consider that the Romans under Emperor Septimius Severus left Scotland in the year 211 and went back down and used Hadrian's Wall as a frontier. So that's 1100 years before the Battle of Bannockburn. That is a long time. Now, had they built a stone bridge here, you may reckon that perhaps there would be some stone foundations left, but to my knowledge, none have ever been found. If it was a timber bridge, well, in the space of 1100 years or over 1100 years, that timber's going to be gone unless it's been frequently replaced and repaired. But we see and hear no evidence of that in the time up to Bannockburn, and no evidence during Bannockburn that they crossed a bridge here. So, in short, it seems very unlikely that there was a crossing here on the Bannockburn at the time of the battle, which makes it much more likely, as we've always suggested and suspected, that they crossed here at the Milton Ford. So, I've just like to give myself confirmation that there was no other crossing places further upstream from the Milton Ford that they may have used for a mass crossing of the Bannockburn Individuals may have found places, but we are talking about a mass crossing of cavalry. There is perhaps the opportunity that the Romans went along the lines of the modern road and crossed in the same vicinity as the modern bridge, and that's why we haven't found too much in the way of remains along this line here. That's a possibility that's been suggested by some. And I concur with that. It could certainly well be the case, so that perhaps a line of the Roman road has been lost to us under this development. But there you go, that's the Roman road. We're now going to have a look at the Milton Ford area and see what would be entailed in the crossing of that for the advancing English and the defending Scottish army. Well, there you are. There's some thoughts on the Roman road and the Roman crossing on the Bannockburn at the time of the battle. If you have any knowledge or thoughts on the Roman road or the potential ford or bridge that was here, get in touch and let me know, because your knowledge will add to the bigger picture of what we think happened during the campaign of 1314. That would be great. So what we're going to do now is we're going to work our way downstream to Milton Ford next and continue downstream to the other crossings. And there's one in particular that really excites me, one that is rarely talked about or mentioned in any of the history books, and its relevance to the Battle of Bannockburn. And I feel it is something that was really important during the rout of the English when they were being chased off the field by King Robert the Bruce and his army. So I'm excited about that, and I'd be keen to get your views on this particular crossing once we get down there. But at the moment, what we're going to do is we're going to go next to the Milton Ford, where we believe the major part of the crossing took place on day one of the Battle of Bannockburn. So let's go and have a look. Got a few friends came down to watch me filming. Here we are at Milton Ford on the banks of the Bannockburn. We have come further downstream from where we were previously at the proposed Roman road, where we've established that there's no real evidence for a ford or a bridge having been there during the campaign of the Battle of Bannockburn. But here at Milton Ford, there was an established ford which had been used going back into the mists of time, used by the Picts, by Sir William Wallace, King Robert the Bruce and the English army, of course, and King James III, who in 1488, after the Battle of Sauchieburn, was famously murdered here at Beaton Mill on the banks of Milton Ford. So a well-established crossing point here. What makes it suitable as a crossing point? Well, you've got gently sloping ground coming down to the Bannockburn behind me here. The Bannockburn itself is narrow and shallow, a perfect crossing point. However, it is a bit of a bottleneck. So as the English advanced with their cavalry, it would have taken them time to cross. Once across, they would get onto a raised spine of ground, which leads down ultimately to through St Ninians, past the kirk, which we know was significant to the Battle of Bannockburn, and on to Stirling Castle. But Bruce knew this was a bottleneck, and he knew that once the English got across, they would want to deploy their cavalry into an effective force. But he employed some very clever tactics to stop that from happening. He had put pits on either side of the road, 3 feet wide, knee deep, with a stake at the bottom, covered in twig and scrub to make it difficult to see. And if the English horse had gone down there, they were breaking a leg or the rider was coming off, making it very difficult. So he had very cleverly marshalled the English into the area where he wanted them. Now Bruce was in front of the woods in an area called the New Park. His right flank was protected on the low ground by some very marshy, boggy area. 2 areas called the Milton Bog and Halbert's Bog. Now these were low-lying areas just to the south of the Roman road where we were previously, and they lead ultimately up towards Broxbray, where the present-day Bannockburn Visitor Centre is. However, if the English cavalry had tried to cross there in any great numbers, they would have been bogged down, slowed down, and would have become sitting targets for the more mobile Scottish spearmen and archers. They would have got taken out. So this is where they've crossed. They've come further downstream from the Roman road area to the Milton Ford. Now famously, just down here, this is where the single combat took place between Bruce and de Boon. De Boon was cleaved through the head with Bruce's axe, killed, and it became the first conflict of the battle. Now, as this was going on, 2 other knights led by Clifford and Beaumont had decided that they would go further downstream to try and outflank the Scots. And that's where we're going to go next, to look at potential crossing places downstream once again. Because the area between the Roman road where we were and here is quite steep-sided. We've established this as a well-established crossing point, but when we go downstream from here, just behind me here, it becomes very gorge-like, and you're not getting any mounted cavalry across there until you get much farther downstream. And we're going to look at those next, where Clifford and Beaumont may have tried to cross. In the meantime, the Scots who had met them at the New Park had routed the English cavalry, sent them packing back across the Bannockburn here under their leaders Gloucester and Hereford, who would have no doubt met with the still advancing English King Edward II. He's made a decision, do I continue to progress, or do I go down onto the Carse and camp for the afternoon and start the conflict tomorrow? And ultimately that's what he did. So this is the Milton Ford, a significant and established crossing area which played a very important part in day one of the Battle of Bannockburn. Let's go further downstream once more and look at some of the other potential crossing areas of Bannockburn back in 1314. Hope you can see the hill behind me that we've come down as I've walked down from Milton Ford towards Spittal Bridge. It's quite steep coming down here. I'm just approaching the Bannockburn from the east bank, crossing a modern pedestrian bridge as it takes me over to the west bank. And if I swing around looking upstream, you'll see the Bannockburn as it flows down towards its estuary with the Forth. It's quite shallow here. It's so overgrown you can't really get a feeling for the steepness of the bankings on either side here. But if I swing around towards the western bank, just in the distance there, it's always difficult to see in film, but you'll see that hill, very steep, quite high. That's going to be impassable for mounted cavalry. But there are crossing places further downstream, so come with me as we continue a re-walk down the side of the Bannockburn to Spittal Ford. I'm walking down the footpath on the west side of the Bannockburn, going downstream towards the Spittal Ford. And I often wonder how well the English knights would have known the area that they were trying to traverse. I do believe some of the senior knights, Clifford and Beaumont amongst them, they've been up to Scotland in campaigns before, so they would have a reasonable knowledge, I'm sure, of the area in which they were travelling. But it's very overgrown in the summer of 2026. I wonder what it was like back in 1314. Once again, I'll show you this west banking. Really would be a major obstacle to any mass mounted cavalry trying to get up there in their efforts to outflank King Robert the Bruce and the Scottish Army. So they're not crossing here. The Bannockburn from Milton Ford down to where we're going at the Spittal Bridge is virtually impassable to mounted cavalry. So let's take a walk down and see. Many people have asked me, what was the weather like during the time of the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314? Well, we do get some small tantalising clues as to what it was like from John Barber, Scottish poet who wrote his epic The Bruce, because when he talks about the engagement between the Scottish knight Thomas Randolph and the English knights Clifford and Beaumont on the first day of the battle on the 23rd of June, he mentions that after the battle, when the Scots had routed the English from the field, that so much dust rose from the plains it almost obscured the sun, and that the sweat was running off the Scottish troops after their exertions. So I guess we've got to presume that at least on the 23rd of June, the first day of the engagement, it was a relatively dry and warm day, as you'd expect in the middle of June. But we do know that in general, the weather was taking a turn for the worst round about this period. Climatically, Europe was coming out of a warm period and entering a colder period. I reckon warm Atlantic conditions had led to lots of rain and much cooler summer temperatures, particularly between 1315 and 1317, when crops failed due to the cold wet weather and a great famine ensued throughout many areas of Europe, including Scotland. But for the Battle of Bannockburn, small clues that we have tell us that the weather was fairly unexceptional, probably in double figures for midsummer in terms of temperature in degrees Celsius. We're just coming round to the area of the modern, if you can call it that, Spittal Bridge. So here we are. We have come downstream from Milton Ford, where we were previously, and we've travelled down the Bannockburn and arrived here at the area called Spittal Bridge, which you see behind me here. Now, Spittal Bridge is a relatively modern bridge in terms of the Battle of Bannockburn, having been built in 1516 by a guy called Robert Spittal. Now, Robert Spittal was a tailor to the King of Scotland, King James V, and Robert Spittal was a generous man, having contributed a number of things to the local economy, including this bridge here. Obviously, in 1516, the bridge was not here at the time of the Battle of Bannockburn. But what was here was an older medieval ford, a crossing point for the merchants of the local area who carried their goods from the northwest to the southeast direction behind me here, as they kept the local economy going. So interestingly, if you continue in a northwest direction in front of me here, up the steep hill, it's still fairly steep, that will take you to the area of St Ninians, and it will take you right past the St Ninians Kirk. Quite interestingly, where Thomas Randolph and the Scottish troops were said to be stationed. If you continue southeast behind me here, ultimately it takes you up through Bannockburn, the village of Bannockburn, and right on towards Pleen, and ultimately through the Torwood, quite interestingly once again. So is this an area that Clifford and Beaumont, the two English knights, with the retinue of between 300 and 500 cavalry, would have considered coming downstream on the Bannockburn to cross and try and outflank the Scots? Well, it's a consideration, isn't it? Personally, I don't think they did cross here. And my reasons are this. When you cross, well, one reason is it's still quite steep, access and egress, coming down here to what would be the medieval ford. And whilst that's okay for a horse and cart on a daily basis, 300 to 500 knights might find it a bit difficult, and it would be a pinch point. Potentially the crossing would be slow, and it would be sitting ducks for King Robert the Bruce's troops, whom I'm sure he would have considered this as a possible weak point and would have it guarded. If they did get across here, it would take them quite close to the main body of the Scottish troop deployment, because that takes you right up towards St Ninians, and as I say, we know that Thomas Randolph was stationed there. Now, if you look back at the chronicles, Thomas Randolph was actually rebuked by King Robert for spotting the advance of Clifford and Beaumont and his mounted cavalry too late. They almost got behind the Scots. Randolph was rebuked and had to rush out onto the field to confront the English cavalry. So I believe if they crossed here, it would take them far too close to the Scottish deployments, and they would have been spotted a lot earlier. So my thoughts are, it would be a consideration for them, but they have probably gone down onto the upper Carse, where many other people believe that they also crossed, and tried to cross along there before coming back up onto the high ground again. However, it's probably best if I let you have a look on a map to see the wider area, and perhaps put the drone up and see a couple of drone shots, and that will give you a perspective of where we are, the topography of the land, and you can fathom out your own thoughts as to what you thought happened when Clifford and Beaumont came further downstream to try and outflank King Robert the Bruce and the Scottish army. Which crossing did they use? There's only a few. This is one of them. Did they use it? So now you've had a look at the surrounding area, what are your thoughts? Do you think that Clifford and Beaumont and his cavalry crossed here? Or like me, do you think that perhaps have gone further downstream? It's an interesting conundrum, like the whole of the Battle of Bannockburn, isn't it? But we're going to continue downstream, so come with me as we go down to the next crossing point on the Upper Carse and have a look at a further crossing point of the Battle of Bannockburn that existed during the time of the battle. Let's go. Well, here we are. We have arrived on what I consider to be the Lower Carse. We have travelled downstream on the Bannockburn from the Roman Road to the Milton Ford to Spittal Bridge and continued further downstream through the gorge, down the steep escarpment of the higher ground of the Carse onto the Lower Carse. So let me just briefly describe where I am. To my right behind me here is the area where day 2 of the Battle of Bannockburn took place. To my left here you see the lovely Bannockburn as it gently meanders its way across the flat carshlands down to its estuary with the tidal river Forth. And it's in this area that the oldest maps show there was a ford here, and indeed a medieval ford. But there's no point in having a ford unless you've got somewhere to come from and somewhere to go to. So what do the maps tell us about what was here all those years ago? Well, we don't have a map going back to 1314, unfortunately, but the oldest maps do tell us that there was a farm here, an orchard farm. So obviously these grounds on the carshland here have been getting farmed, and probably right back as far back as 1314. Now, you need tracks and roads to access the farmland, to harvest your crops and to get your goods to and from the market. So it's likely that there's been an extensive network of tracks and roads down here on the flat carshland. Now, many people consider the carshland, the whole of the carshland down here, was a flat, marshy, boggy, peat-ridden, hag-ridden area that was almost impossible to cross. But that's not the case, is it? Recent evidence has come to light after some studies that were done by a chap called Richard Tipping and Stirling University. They studied the topography of the ground here, and they concluded that as you come off the steep escarpment, the runoff of water there would lead to boggy, wet area, peat-ridden. But once you got across that, the further north you come, the ground becomes firmer and harder, much more conducive to camping and the battle, on which John Barber, the Scotch poet, talked about the English crossed onto the hard field. So the battle conditions during day 2 of the battle must have been fairly unexceptional, or they would have been mentioned in the chronicles, and they weren't. So it's my thought that there's been a more extensive network of tracks and roads down here on the carshland than many people give credit for. That being the case, is this where Clifford and Beaumont, the English knights with their retinue cavalry, 3 to 500, is this the place they've come down to cross the ford on the Bannockburn here as they tried to outflank the Scottish army, who were further up on the high ground, out of sight on the high ground at the New Park and the Dryfield area. Have they crossed here onto the flat karstland and used the tracks that probably existed to take them where they were eventually spotted below the kirk, or in the area of the Kirk of St Ninians. Thereupon Thomas Randolph, the Scottish knight, came out with his troops, and a confrontation took place between Randolph and his Scottish army and Clifford and Beaumont and English cavalry, and they were routed from the field. Now, some of them, when they were routed, fled up to Stirling Castle. Now, how could they flee up there if this was a boggy, marshy area with no network of tracks or roads? They've somehow managed to get from the cars up to Stirling Castle. The rest of them fled, backtracking their own footsteps, crossed the ford here, back to the main body of the English army, and they came down here and camped for the afternoon and evening on the 23rd of June before day 2 of the battle. So that's the consideration of many people. What are your thoughts? What do you think? What's your thoughts about what the Carse was like in 1314? Was it this impenetrable, impassable, marshy, boggy area? Was it much more connected with tracks and roads, as is suggested by where I am going to take you next, at the next crossing further downstream on the Bannockburn? This is the one that excites me the most, because it is rarely talked about in the history books in relationship to the Battle of Bannockburn. But it's my thoughts that there was a major road which travelled from east to west and north to south across the karstlands here. And that would put a new slant on the movement of the troops during the period of the Battle of Bannockburn. So I'm quite excited to take you there and discuss my thoughts on that and get your views about what may have happened back then. So let's go from the lower karstland here and the lower Carse ford and downstream to our next crossing, our second last crossing on the Bannockburn, as we cover all the crossing points that existed or potentially existed at the time of the battle. Well, we've arrived on the banks of the Bannockburn, not without some difficulty, I can assure you. But here on my right hand side you can see the Bannockburn, and you can see where it's flowing under the concrete tunnels of the modern day Crook Bridge, over the top of which the A905 is a main arterial route that comes from the Ayr to the Thross direction in a east-west direction and into Stirling. So why have I brought you here? Well, just as we discussed at the lower Carse crossing at the ford there, we mentioned that we felt that this area on the karstland wasn't the boggy, marshy, haggy, impassable area that many people consider it to be, that it was interconnected with paths, tracks and bridleways. And it's my thoughts that in this area we also had a major arterial route back at the time of the Battle of Bannockburn, one that isn't very often talked about, particularly in relation to the route of the English and the impact it may have had back then. So that's why I've brought you down here. Now, just as at the lower Carse where we were before, we've come further north towards the River Forth, and this was an area of farmland which was owned by the monks at Cambuskenneth Abbey, which is probably over here in what I think is a northwesterly direction from where I'm standing on the Bannockburn just now. Now, just like the farmers, the abbots and the monks at the abbey, they needed access to their various farmsteads to get their produce back and forward. And interestingly, we also know that they had a residence at Throsk in an easterly direction here, a manor or a grange where the abbot used to go to conduct some of his business. So he needed access to that, didn't he? So how did he get that? Well, we know that there was a ford at Cambuskenneth Abbey, which is on the far bank of the Forth from where we are, and people have used that ford going back into the mists of time. And it's my thoughts that for a ford you need a road coming in and a road going out of it. Now, if we look at a great website called Old Roads of Scotland, I'll put a link in the description, go in and have a look, it's a fascinating resource. The chap there shows you a road from the time of Bannockburn coming from the ford at Cambuskenneth, almost directly the line of sight across the Carse toward Throsk. And I've had a look at that and I've pondered it for a while. How do we know there was a road there at all, or the abbots had a road? Well, fascinatingly, this is what excites me about this area down here and the lack of discussion that's been had about it. There's a charter called the Fulch Charter, which is dated from the 1200s, and in that it discusses the gift of land from one of the local gentry here to the abbots of Cambuskenneth Abbey, effectively for the salvation of his soul and his family's soul. That's what people did back then. And in it, as he described the land, he mentions various reference points, boundaries of the land. The final one, the first and the final ones, talk about referencing from the abbot's great cart or carriage road round various landmarks and back to the abbot's great cart or carriage road. What a great description that is, the great cart or carriage road. So this isn't a minor track, this is a carriage or cart road designed to take oxen and horse and carts to get grain, wheat, barley back and forward from their lands at the farm down here in the Forth, and to get the abbot in his carriage to his manor at Throsk and back, and in my view also up towards Stirling. We also know the abbots looked over the parish of St Ninians, and they would need access to St Ninians. So once again, through the Bridle Pass, I believe there was a road from the Abbot Ford north-south direction going up into the direction of St Ninians, and the main east-west going from the Airth, Throsk, and across the Bannockburn and the Pelstream and into Stirling. So what route do I think it took? Well, the land here, north of where we previously were and closer to the River Forth, is about 10 feet lower the closer you get to the Forth on average than the modern day A905. Now, if you wanted a great carriage or cart road to be available to you, you'd want it to be available for the best part of the year. So you wouldn't build it on land which is probably subject to seasonal flooding. So rather than come direct line of sight across to Throsk, my thoughts are they've come in a more north to south direction to join up across an area called Springkerse, to join up with what is the area of the modern A905. They've crossed the Pelstream on a bridge or a ford, across the Bannockburn on a bridge or a ford, and out to the residence at Throsk and onwards to the area of Airth, and likewise it would go westward into Stirling and northwards up to their parish of St Ninians. And that's what I find fascinating, because it is rarely, if ever, talked about in relationship to the Battle of Bannockburn. But it's a major carriage road that must have been there at the time that the rout of the English was taking place. Another thing that often bothers me and fascinates me is during the rout they talk about the number of dead in the Bannockburn being so great that you could walk dry-shod across them. But they also talk about the great numbers drowned in the River Forth. And that's exercised my mind for quite some time. If they crossed the Bannockburn from a west to east direction to drown in the Forth, they would need to cross the Bannockburn a second time, which doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So they've obviously fled in a westerly direction across the Pell Stream. Was it across the great carriage road, ford or bridge that may have been there? On across the Springkerse area towards Stirling, did they join up with Abbott's Great Carriage Road and try to make their way to the ford at Cambuskenneth? Is that where they drowned? Or in the area of Forth Bank? These are questions that need to be answered. Now, to give you a better perspective of where I am, it's probably better to look at some maps and put a drone up just to give you a wider aerial view, because we're down in a bit of a hollow here and it's difficult to get a wider view of just what we're talking about. So I'm going to do that just now. We'll look at the map, we'll put the drone up, and we'll come back to conclude this discussion about a very little often mentioned great cart or great carriage road of the Abbots that we know existed in the period 12 and the 1300s at the time of Bannockburn. What impact did it have on those fleeing troops of the English? And indeed, what impact did it have on the English as they came up to the Carse with their baggage train? Is it something they perhaps used? Let's look at the maps and get the drone up and we'll come back. Unfortunately, we couldn't get the drone up. It's the middle of June 2026 and it just doesn't seem to want to stop raining. It's incredible. However, we are here on the National Library of Scotland geo-reference maps, and hopefully this can give you an indication of the areas we've been in. So let me just give you a summary of where we've been and where we are at Crook Bridge. If you remember, we started at the proposed roaming road and where it crossed the Bannockburn, which was in this area here. You see the Bannockburn coming down this line of trees, and the proposed Roman road ran across here and across the Bannockburn. Let me just show you that on it's an 1885 map, which we've used for clarity, and it has some of the detail that we require. Here you see the site of the Roman road running parallel to the modern road and its proposed crossing point on the Bannockburn there. So that's where we started our film. And coming downstream from there, we went to Milton Ford at Beaton Mill, where King James III was killed and where the crossing of the English vanguard, English cavalry, took place on day one of the the Battle of Bannockburn. So we continued downstream at further areas, and this area here is very gorge-like. It's unable to be crossed by mass-mounted cavalry, but that took us down to the area of Spittal Bridge. Let me just show you that there. There's the Milton Ford there, and there is Spittal Bridge, where there once existed a medieval ford as well, and we discussed the pros and cons of Clifford and Bowman potentially crossing there. We continued further downstream still to an area on the Lower Carse Ford. Now this is Balquidderock Wood, and right along here runs an escarpment, quite a steep escarpment, from the higher Carse down to the lower Carse. If I can just highlight that for you, I'll zoom out a little bit and highlight that for you. Down here, the land slopes down from the higher Carse to the lower Carse, going down about a 30-degree slope onto this lower area of Carse land here. And as I say, our next area, Let me just get rid of that. Takes us down to the Lower Cars Ford, which was in this area. Let me just get the map up and show you again. And zoom out so we can see it clearly. Here's Skeoch. Here's the Balquidroch Wood we were looking at. And here's the ford here. Now, interestingly, remember we talked about the potential for the cars not being this marsh-ridden impassable place, but interconnected with paths and bridleways. Farmers today need the same requirements of farmers 400, 500, 600, 700 years ago. They need access to their fields and their produce, and they need to get it to the markets. So they need these interconnected paths and bridleways. And I've often thought, why reinvent the wheel? If you've constructed a path or bridleway, newer ones tend to be built on top of older ones. It's my thought that there was a greater connection of roads, paths and bridleways at the time of Bannockburn than many people give the cars credit for. And then ultimately we have come down to the area. If you just have a look, it's quite difficult to see, but this line here is the Pell Stream burn, and this line here is the Bannockburn. And day 2 of the Battle of Bannockburn took place between the Pell Stream here and the Bannockburn here. When the rout took place, the English fled in all directions. Let me just get the arrow back up again. They would have fled from west to east across the Bannockburn, and they would have fled from south to north across the Pell Stream. We know that many of them made their way up to Stirling Castle, and this is where the crossings, I believe, at Crook Bridge come into play. But just to touch on one thing which has exercised my mind, and I briefly mentioned, if indeed many of the English fled west to east across the Bannockburn, we're told that the bodies were so thick there you could walk across them dry-shod, and also many of them drowned in the Forth. If they drowned in the Forth and had fled this way, they would need to turn north and cross the Bannockburn again to get to the Forth, so that doesn't make sense. So those that drowned in the Forth had to have fled across the Pell Stream here. Let me just show you one more time. They had to have fled in this direction. Now, this brings into play what we've discussed about the Abbot's Great Carriage Road. So let me just show you. Let's zoom out a bit. Here we see Cambus Kenneth Abbey and the ford that existed. Now, where did that ford lead to? We know that they had a residence at Throsk. Now, there's an excellent resource online called Old Roads of Scotland. Let me just show you that. Here's a Cambus Kenneth Abbey. Here's a confluence between the Pell Stream and the Bannockburn. And here's Throsk, which we've been looking at. Now, it's an excellent resource. Please go in and have a look. And he's highlighted one of the possible courses of the Abbot's Great Carriage Road, basically being line of sight across the Carsland to Throsk. My own thoughts on that are that that would take him across the lower lying land of the Cars, which would be subject to seasonal flooding. And I do believe they would have followed the road which is shown on the map here and joining up in the area of the old carriage road would be in the area of the present day A905, which takes you out to Throsk. Now, the ground here is about 10 feet higher on average than the ground down here and less subject to seasonal flooding. Let's get back to the map again. Now, that being the case, given the route of the English soldiers had followed in the footsteps of their king, according to some chroniclers, well, we know the king went up to Stirling Castle and he was refused entry. Where did the routed soldiers go who went in the westerly direction? Would they have crossed a ford or a bridge here at the Pell Stream and come across the Abbot's Great Carriage Road? Would some of them have perhaps followed it down towards Cambus Kenneth Abbey? Now, bear in mind that this was supposedly raided the night before on the 23rd, and that news would have spread all throughout the English army, so they would know of the existence of the ford and the abbey. Or have they come along here and many of them try to cross at the Forth Bank area to get to the abbey, where great numbers of them are said to have drowned, pursued by the Scots army at the point of the Scottish spear. It seems to make sense, doesn't it? So we've had those who have fled eastwards, have come over the Bannockburn here and turned north, following their footsteps to what they think is safety, and others who have fled in a northwesterly direction, perhaps joined up with the Abbott's Great Carriage Road, which went west to east, north to south, and fled towards the banks of the Forth, looking for some kind of sanctuary on the other side, and many of them have drowned there. And we know, as mentioned in previous films, that the tide was at high tide level at about 7 o'clock in the morning. So it's an interesting thought, and one deserving of much more scrutiny. So in a future film, we're going to look much closer about the history and the potential route of the Abbott's Great Carriage Road. Now, as you can see, here is the present day A905. I did this last part of the film from this area here. This is where it crosses the present day Crook Bridge. As you can see, there's always been a bridge in that area. If you go down there for a look, be very careful. Make sure you're physically agile, because you've got to go through these woods and it's very steep and slippy, so do take care if you go down for a look there. And as you can see, I believe that the Great Carriage Road would have come from the Abbey. Let me just make it a bit clearer. From the Abbey, followed the higher ground here. As you can see, we're 40 feet here, 36, 41, 42, whereas down on the lower, the area of Carse nearer the Forth, 26, 23, 24, subject to seasonal flooding. You'd want to stay away from these areas and come up to the higher spine here. And I think it's deserving of much more scrutiny and archaeology, because if we can determine the route and the nature of the Abbott's Great Carriage Road, that would lend a great deal of information to the route of the English at the Battle of Bannockburn, and let us better understand the events of that day. So something that we will be covering in a future film. But let's get back to where we are. Did you find that interesting? Do you have any knowledge of the Great Cart Road or some of the tracks and bridleways down here during the time of the battle? If you do, get in touch, because each bit of knowledge that we have adds another little piece of the jigsaw to the bigger picture of the Battle of Bannockburn. And ultimately, until we find some definitive proof, until we find the dead bodies or find something that directly relates to the Battle of Bannockburn, there'll always be a bit of conjecture about what happened and where it took place. So this is what I find fascinating. And we need to do that, and we need to do it fairly quickly actually, because there's the pace of development in the area on and surrounding the battle area, the Battle of Bannockburn, is increasing rapidly, and we're steadily losing areas of the battleground. So it's important that we gather as much knowledge as we can. I would like to see more archaeological studies getting done. Let's find the Great Carriage Road. Let's then figure out how it impacted on the battle in 1314. But thanks again anyway. I hope you've enjoyed that. As I say, if you've got any information on the area of the Great Carriage Road and the ford and how it impacted the battle, get in touch and let me know. We're heading now to our final bridge on the Bannockburn, which is the access to what would have been, back in those days, it would have been the access to the Taylorton, Balfourknott and Stewart Hall area. So let's go and have a look at that. Hopefully I get there before the heavens open and the rain comes pouring down. Well, here we are at our sixth and final crossing point on the Bannockburn as it relates to the Battle of Bannockburn. We started in the area of the potential crossing at the Roman Road, came downstream from there to Milton Ford and Beaton's Mill area, further down to Spittal Bridge, and from there further downstream once more to the Lower Cars crossing, then on to the fascinating Crook Bridge area, and now you find us here at the access to Taylorton, Stuart Hall and the Balfourknott areas of the Carsland down in this direction behind me here. So was there a bridge here back in 1314? Well, that's hard to say. This bridge only shows on maps going as far back as 1800s and nothing much earlier. But then that's not surprising, because nor do a lot of other landmarks that we know were there. Older maps tended not to go into great detail. However, this was great farming land down there and may well have been owned by the abbots at Cambus Kenneth, so you needed to get access. I suspect there's always been a bridge here to access the farmlands down there. Modern access comes off the A91 now, which obviously wasn't there back in 1314, but I believe this was here. What we've got here is a small stone humpback bridge. I don't really have any details on it. If you do, get in touch and let me know, because as I say, it helps to build a much more detailed and better picture of the history of the crossing places on the Bannockburn. So let me know, I'd be fascinated to find out. Was this involved at any point in the Battle of Bannockburn? Probably not. It's a bit too far out of the way, although you may have had the occasional straggler, as they had been routed from the battlefield, lost and confused finding their way over here. And there are those who contend that the battle took place in the Spring Kerse and Stuart Hall area, although modern interpretation by most people accept it was definitely between the Pearl Stream and the Bannockburn. So I don't think it had a major impact on the Battle of Bannockburn at all, but it is a crossing place on the Bannockburn and there is quite a bit of history here. So I hope you have enjoyed our look at the crossing places on the Bannockburn and how they link to the battle. It's been a fascinating insight. There's always something new to find out with regards to the battle, isn't there? New bits of information and new thought processes. And I love to play devil's advocate. Could this have happened? Did this happen? Is it possible that this could have happened? I would certainly like to find out more about the Abbott's Great Cart or Carriage Road and the impact of that. We really need to do a lot more study and archaeology to find out the route that took and the impact that would have had. That would be something fascinating to do, wouldn't it? But we need to do it fairly soon, because we are losing a lot of what's left of the battlefield to development. So it would be great to find out. We've got such better technologies these days that would be able to help us with the effort and support and input. It would be able to help us to perhaps find more definitive proof of exactly where the battle took place. I hope you've enjoyed our look at the crossing places on the Bannockburn. It's been another fascinating insight. Once again, if you have any knowledge or information that might help, please get in touch and let me know. It's great to take all these little pieces of the jigsaw and put them together to help build that more complete picture of what the area looked like back then. If you have enjoyed it, watch out for future episodes, because we're going to continue to look at stories of the battle and also how things are developing with modern development and the impact on the battlefield. So like and subscribe and you'll get notified of when future films come up. But thank you for joining me today. This has been a long film. Hopefully I'm getting a bit better at them. Hopefully you're still enjoying the content, and I look forward to you joining me for more episodes in future. Thank you.